Operation Pat 2, Assault in the Pacific. It wasn't a famous island. Not one you'd find in history books or printed on a t-shirt in a gift shop. No pearl white beaches, no palm trees and postcards. Just a smudge on a faded naval map. Somewhere out there, past where the typhoon winds go quiet. We called it Pat 2, short for Patrol Area Tango, though no one ever explained why. All I knew was that it was small, it was crawling with Japanese fortifications, and it was ours to take. That's where it all started. And where a part of me never left. The water was too warm, like soup, and it reeked of fuel. You couldn't tell where the ocean ended and the blood began. I remember the deck of the Higgins boat bucking under our feet, the air thick with diesel fumes and God knows what else. My hands shook, not from fear, not exactly. It was like my body already knew something my mind was trying to deny. I was 23, a Marine, Private First Class John Ramirez, serial number 043759, Charlie Company. I wasn't brave. I wasn't even particularly strong. But I had this kid next to me, Freddie Delgado from Milwaukee, who cracked jokes about coconut crabs as we waited for the ramp to drop. Said if we made it through, he was going to open a bar back home. Call it the Salty Fox. Said I could bartend, even though I couldn't mix a drink to save my life. I nodded and told him sure I'd be there. I lied. When that metal ramp slammed open, time slowed. Or maybe it shattered. Sound came in bursts, like the war didn't know how to speak in full sentences. Gunfire, yelling, the whine of ricochets. I lunged into the surf and tasted salt, gunpowder, and something bitter. A bullet zipped past my ear and kissed the ocean behind me. The beach wasn't sand, not really, more like ground-up coral and bone, sharp enough to slice through boots. Freddie was still beside me. Then he wasn't. The maps didn't show the pillboxes. They sure as hell didn't mention the trenches carved into the hillside, or the way the jungle itself seemed to breathe and scream. The Japanese weren't waiting to die. They were dug in deep, like the island was theirs and we were the infection. Their machine guns didn't sweep, they stalled. The moment a man stood an inch too high, he was gone. Not just hit, erased. I dropped behind a chunk of driftwood, if that's even what it was. Could have been a piece of a ship, could have been someone's coffin. I couldn't tell anymore. My rifle jammed, sand in the bowl. My hands were shaking too much to fix it. Nearby, someone was screaming in a language I didn't understand. Or maybe I did. Maybe it didn't need words. By midday, the beach was a graveyard. Helmets floated like dead crabs in the shallows. Smoke curled up from broken palms, black against a sky too blue for what was happening. We pushed forward inch by inch, not because we were brave, but because there was no going back. Behind us was the surf. Ahead, hell with green leaves. We reached a ridge just before sundown, and I remember thinking it was over. It wasn't. The moment we crested, the jungle opened fire again. Not just rifles this time, grenade, mortars. It felt like the trees themselves had teeth. Freddie. No, not Freddie. He was gone already. It was Corporal Hauser, the guy who once tried to make pancakes on a flamethrower tank. He took a round to the neck and dropped like a marionette with cut strings. I crawled over his body, not out of disrespect, but because there was nowhere else to go. And then came night. You haven't known fear until you tried to sleep in a hole you dug with your own hands, knowing someone just 50 feet away is doing the same, except they want you dead. I carved out that foxhole with a helmet and a busted entrenching tool, curled into it like an animal. The moon came up, pale and guilty. I pressed my back to the earth and prayed for silence. Instead, I got whispers. Not voices, not really, just the kind of sounds that live in your bones after too much killing. Somewhere in the dark, a Japanese soldier screamed. Just once. Then silence. We all heard it. No one moved. It was like the island itself was trying to remember who it belonged to. And that was only day one. The second morning didn't begin so much as it bled into view. There was no sunrise, no sense of hope curling over the edge of the horizon. Just a gray kind of light, tired and sticky, filtering through the low, churning clouds like someone had scraped the color out of the sky. I had maybe slept 20 minutes all night, curled in a crater that smelled of copper and smoke, with my helmet over my face and my rifle clutched like a crucifix. Around me, men stirred or didn't. Some were already gone, their names whispered in the damp air by the few of us still hanging on by a fraying thread of will. We weren't fighting for strategy anymore. That was for the generals back on the ships, warm and dry, pushing pins into maps and sipping black coffee. Down here, on this cursed patch of coral and jungle, we fought for inches, sometimes for the right to stand 1 foot higher than before, sometimes for the chance to breathe one more time before the next wave of artillery came in. The radio had gone dead sometime before dawn, and the only message we'd gotten before it fizzled out was this: push inland. Objectives unchanged. That was it. Objectives unchanged. As if the island hadn't changed us already. We moved out just after what passed for sunrise, dragging ourselves across terrain that didn't want us, that resisted every step. The jungle wasn't thick, it was dense. It swallowed light, muffled sound, made it impossible to tell how far or close the enemy was. Every tree looked like a sniper's nest, every root a booby trap. The Japanese had tunneled into the hills, their bunkers camouflaged, so well that you wouldn't see them until the barrels of their rifles blinked at you like cruel eyes. We lost 4 men before we even knew we were in a kill zone. They just dropped. No drama, no warning, 1 second walking, the next falling like rag dolls. I remember tripping over a vine and landing face first into the mud. My mouth filled with it, bitter and warm, and as I wiped it away, I realized it wasn't mud. It was blood, thick, dark, almost black in the half-light. Someone had died there, maybe hours ago, maybe days. You stop keeping track. Your brain starts filtering out the horror, because if it didn't, it would break clean in two. That's what war does. It's not just about bullets and bombs. It rewires you. It makes your hands shake even when there's no sound, makes your heart race at the sight of shadows, makes you forget your own voice, your own name. By midday, we reached what they called Hill 11, though it was more of a mound than a hill, overgrown with gnarled roots and moss-covered stone. That was when we heard the drums. Not literal drums, not like in the movies, but the sound of the mortars, the steady thump-thump-thump of the shells being launched from somewhere we couldn't see. It echoed across the canopy, distant and hollow, like war had found its own heartbeat. We scattered instinctively, ducking under what cover we could find, as explosions began to stitch the ground around us. The earth buckled and groaned, flinging debris and shrapnel in all directions. I remember the distinct pop of a tree being split in half, then the scream that followed. Maybe Patterson, maybe Lynch. We didn't have time to check. You couldn't afford compassion when death was operating by the second. That was the day I watched Staff Sergeant Kemper stand up in full view of enemy fire and charge a machine gun nest with nothing but a satchel of grenades and a busted leg. We'd been pinned for over an hour, flattened into the mud like pressed flowers, and the air was thick with flies, smoke, and prayers no one dared say out loud. Kemper didn't say anything either. He just limped forward, slow at first, then faster, gritting his teeth as bullets snapped past him like angry bees. We heard 3 explosions. The firing stopped. Then silence. That awful silence that tells you someone did something heroic and that they're not coming back to hear you thank them. By the time night fell, we had secured Hill 11, whatever that meant. There was nothing to celebrate. The bunkers were charred, the trees splintered, the ground littered with things I won't describe, because even now, all these years later, some images aren't meant to be spoken aloud. I found a canteen with a name etched into it, Shinzo, and I remember wondering who he'd been, what he looked like as a boy, whether he'd loved someone, whether he'd been scared, just like us. I left the canteen where it was. Some things aren't meant to be trophies. That night, we didn't sleep. We just sat in our foxholes, the jungle crackling around us, as if the island itself was whispering. It was humid beyond belief, and the sweat never dried. It just clung to your skin like oil. Mosquitoes bit us in places you didn't know you had. Somewhere nearby, a man cried softly. Not because he was hurt, just because he couldn't take it anymore. And I understood. I think we all did. No one said a word. We just let him cry. And then, around 3 in the morning, the jungle exploded. It wasn't a shell. It wasn't gunfire. It was screaming, raw, feral screaming, as dozens of Japanese soldiers burst from the undergrowth in a bonsai charge, their silhouettes like phantoms lit only by muzzle flashes and the occasional flare. It was chaos pure and thick, like the air had turned to fire and madness. I shot until my rifle clicked dry. then grab my bayonet and stab at shapes I could barely see, my hands slick with sweat and something else. One of them tackled me, and we rolled into a shallow ditch, fists flying, blades flashing. I don't remember how it ended. I only remember his eyes. Wide, scared, not angry, just scared. When the sun rose again, I couldn't feel my legs. I was still alive, somehow half covered in someone else's blood, my ears ringing from the concussive noise of the fight. We had held a line, but there were fewer of us now. Much fewer. Freddy wasn't there, the count heads. Kemper was gone. Hauser, too. Half our platoon, wiped away in the night, like the ocean had reached up and claimed them. But I was still breathing, and that meant we had to keep going. Even then, we didn't know it was only the beginning. The third day arrived not as a promise, but as a test, and by then we had stopped counting in hours or meals or distance, and had started measuring time by what we had lost: men, sanity, small pieces of ourselves. The island, whose name I still don't know, had changed texture, as if it had absorbed the blood and fear of the past 48 hours and decided to return the favor. The soil had become softer in some places, almost sponge-like, soaked through with rot and diesel, and in others, it was so hard and dry that your boots scraped it like bone. The air no longer smelled like the sea. It smelled like cordite, iron, and something older, like something buried deep in the roots of the jungle, had been awakened by our presence, and now watched us move through its domain with quiet, patient disdain. I remember a strange calmness settling over me that morning, not peace, not relief, but a dull awareness that death wasn't necessarily waiting up ahead anymore. It was already walking beside me, like a silent companion, matching my steps, not in a hurry, just there. I wasn't afraid in the way I had been the first day, when the beach lit up with machine gun fire and chaos had a rhythm. Now fear had become part of the background music, like the insects humming in the canopy or the occasional burst of static from a damaged field radio. We were numb, not out of courage, but out of necessity. You can't feel everything all at once and expect to survive. They told us our objective was a communications tower the Japanese had hidden somewhere near the northern edge of the island, likely buried in the limestone hills or inside one of the many caves that riddled the place like termite holes. Intelligence said it was critical, that it was feeding information back to Tokyo and had to be taken out before the fleet could move in closer. But for most of us, it wasn't about that. The tower could have been a lighthouse, or a rock, or a rumor. What we were really chasing was an end, any end, to the relentless, suffocating hell we'd been dropped into. We moved in silence, staggered through the jungle like ghosts with rifles, past trees stripped bare by gunfire and vines that hung like veins torn from the earth. Somewhere ahead, a sniper had pinned down second squad for over 2 hours. We couldn't see him, couldn't hear him breathe, but every 15 minutes, like clockwork, another man would drop and we'd all flinch and then try to pretend we hadn't. There was a moment, one I'll never forget, when Lieutenant Franklin, our new CO after Kemper, pulled off his helmet, looked up at the trees and laughed. It wasn't joy or madness. It was the sound of someone who understood too late that there was no real plan, no clarity, just the illusion of control handed down by men who didn't have to wade through the mud or stare down the muzzle of a Type 99. Eventually, someone tossed a smoke grenade, and in the confusion, we flanked left and stumbled upon a narrow trail lined with crude wooden stakes, each one carved with symbols we didn't recognize. I remember brushing my hand against one of them and feeling a chill shoot up my arm, like the wood itself was humming with memory. We joked about curses and island spirits. Freddy would have made some crack about haunted coconuts, but no one laughed. Not really. Humor had become a tool, like our bayonets. You used it when you needed to keep moving forward, when screaming didn't help anymore. The trail led us to the entrance of a cave system, black as pitch, smelling of ammonia and rust. We lit a flare and peered in, the walls slick with condensation, or maybe blood. It was impossible to tell. That was where we found them, not the enemy, but the remains of those who'd come before. American gear, Japanese helmets, torn uniforms, rusted dog tags, journals half dissolved by mildew. It was like stumbling into a tomb no one had meant to dig. And somewhere in there, deeper than we could reach without lights or backup, we heard breathing. Or at least I did. Slow, deep, and unnatural. It didn't echo like our voices had. It lingered like a presence. We never went further into the cave. The air turned thick and unwelcoming, and someone, Donovan, I think, began shaking uncontrollably, whispering something about faces in the stone. So we backed out slowly, quietly, like children trying not to wake a sleeping parent. And just as we emerged back into the sunlight, thinking the worst was behind us, the ridge above us erupted with gunfire. Not a few shots in ambush. Coordinated, furious, unrelenting. I remember falling hard into the dirt, scrambling behind a fallen tree, my hands instinctively slapping a fresh clip into my rifle. Bullets tore leaves into confetti, ripped through bark, and sent up sprays of rock as they slammed into the cave walls. We lost control of the trail instantly, and the line broke. Men scattered, some running blind into the jungle, others trying to flank the ridge. I stayed where I was not out of bravery, but because my leg had been hit, not a clean shot, more like a burn, a graze from a ricochet that still made every step feel like fire was eating my thigh. Somehow, I spotted Sanders ahead of me, pinned behind a mound of stone, bleeding from his shoulder, but still firing, slow and deliberate. He caught my eye and motioned, pointed toward a gap in the ridge, a weak spot. I crawled, dragging my rifle and my leg, and together, with no plan, no command, we did something that still doesn't make sense to me. We charged. Just the two of us ducking and dodging through the smoke, yelling without words, fueled by adrenaline and something older than training, survival, maybe. We reached the ridge. Sanders lobbed a grenade over the top. It bounced once, twice, then a dull whump that silenced the guns for 3 full seconds. That's all we needed. We climbed up and over. The trench was full of smoke and bodies. I don't know who we shot. I don't know how many. I only know that when it was over, Sanders was gone. I didn't see him fall. I didn't see where he was hit. One moment he was next to me, panting and nodding like we just won something. The next, he was face down quiet, still holding his rifle. I stayed with him until the others arrived. And when they did, no one said anything. They just looked at the ground, then back at the jungle, and kept moving. Orders came through. What was left of them? The tower had been destroyed by an airstrike that morning. The objective was complete. We were to hold position and wait for extraction. And just like that, the island was quiet again. The fourth and final day felt less like an ending and more like a slow unraveling of everything we had managed to keep stitched together inside ourselves. The quiet wasn't relief. It was eerie, like the silence after a thunderclap when your ears ring and the world still feels tilted. No gunfire, no shouting, no distant thump of artillery, only the wind moving through the broken palms and the steady hum of insects that had returned as if nothing had happened. Some of us started to believe we'd been forgotten, stranded on this piece of hell carved from the sea, left to rot while the war spun on elsewhere. Others, like me, weren't sure we hadn't died already, and just hadn't realized it yet. We held the ridge as ordered, what was left of us, less than a platoon, dug in along a shattered line of trees and cratered rocks, facing the jungle as if it still held something worse. Our eyes stung from the constant smoke, and our skin was blistered in patches from sun, salt, and exposure. There's no shade anymore. No clean water. The medkits had run dry, and food was down to dried biscuits and whatever you could scavenge off the dead. I remember chewing on a chunk of hardtack until my teeth ached and still feeling like I was starving. The hunger wasn't just in the gut. It was in the soul, in the place where hope used to live. We buried Sanders at dawn, just off the ridge under a tree that still had half its leaves. Used our bayonets to dig through the soil, though it felt like trying to cut through concrete with spoons. No ceremony, no chaplain. Just a dog tag on a broken branch and a few words whispered through clenched teeth. I wanted to say something more, something real, but all that came out was a rasping. "You did good, man." And then I stood, wiped my hands on my trousers, and walked away before anyone could see whatever was trying to crawl out of my chest. The radio came back to life sometime mid-morning, or what passed for morning under that murky sky. Static at first, then a faint voice. "Navy patrol boats inbound. Hold your position. Prepare to mark the beach with signal flares." Reinforcements? No, just retrieval. We weren't being replaced. We were being extracted, what was left of us, to be patched up, refitted, and likely dropped into the next circle of hell somewhere west of here. That was the war. A conveyor belt. Men fed into the meat grinder, reshaped, renamed, and pushed forward again until their luck ran out or the headlines caught up. Still, we didn't move. Something in us didn't trust it. We waited. We watched. The jungle hadn't finished with us, not yet. Around noon, I saw movement along the tree line, slow, purposeful, not a bird, not wind. I raised my rifle, but my hands didn't want to obey anymore. I was trembling, not out of fear, but fatigue so deep it felt baked into my bones. Then others saw it too. A single man, Japanese, walking toward us unarmed, covered in mud and blood, with a strip of white cloth tied around his head. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at us, then slowly raised his hands, palms open. No gun, no knife, just surrender. Or maybe something else. We didn't shoot. No one said a word. We just stood there, staring, until Lieutenant Franklin stepped forward and motioned for the man to come closer. He did, eyes down, shoulders bowed. Someone whispered, "He's just a kid," and couldn't have been older than 17. His uniform was shredded, and his face looked like it hadn't smiled in years. We gave him water, sat him under a tarp, and tried not to look him in the eye. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel anything. If anything, I felt shame. Like we'd all been tricked into this great madness, and now standing on a mound of ash and grief, the enemy didn't seem so different after all. That night, the boats arrived, dark shapes slicing through the water, their engines low and steady. The beach flared red with signal smoke, and we moved out in silence, limping and staggering, the wounded supported by the barely standing. We left behind our trenches, our dead, the ghost of the boy we used to laugh with, and the voices that still echoed in the jungle even after the fight was done. I turned back once, just once, as I stepped onto the landing craft and saw the ridge where Freddie had died, saw the tree where Sanders was buried, saw the hole I had slept in that first night while the sky caught fire. The island didn't look strategic from that angle. It looked haunted. It looked hungry. Back on the ship, someone tried to hand me coffee, and I took it with both hands even though they were shaking. I sat against a bulkhead while medics moved through the deck, treating wounds, whispering names, writing tags. A chaplain walked past with a Bible and a worn expression. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the engine and the distant crash of waves. Around me, men were asleep sitting up, others sobbed quietly into their sleeves. No one talked about what we'd done. Not yet. Maybe not ever. A week later, I stood in line on a base in the Philippines, answering questions for a debrief. What unit? What objective? What losses? I gave the answers they wanted, not because I believed them, but because it was easier than trying to explain what it felt like. No one wanted to hear about the cave. No one wanted to know about the breathing I'd heard in the dark or the faces I still saw when I closed my eyes. They just wanted facts, numbers, outcomes, and I gave them. Years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with the taste of jungle rot in my mouth and the sound of mortars in my ears. My wife doesn't ask anymore. She just puts a hand on my chest until my breathing slows. I tell people I was on an island during the war, but I never tell them the name. Maybe I never knew it. Maybe it never had one. To me, it's just the place where we became something else, where the war stopped being a cause or a country and turned into a long scream echoing through the trees. Operation Pat 2 never made the headlines. There was no grand announcement, no medals given on camera, no generals shaking hands in front of flags. It was just one of many, one more bleeding page in a book too thick to hold the weight of every man who didn't come home. But for those of us who were there, who walked the ash, who dug our friends' graves with our hands and laughed through the tears just to stay sane, it will always be the day the jungle opened its mouth and tried to swallow us whole, and almost did. And sometimes when the world gets too quiet, I still hear it breathing.